Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Very great segue into Professor Swaran Singh's presentation. Now, over to you, sir.
Thank you. Delighted to be once again with the IMPRI team. Thank you to Simi and Arjun, of course. And I heard Reet and Avi also spoke in the beginning. Delighted to be with General Chakrabarti, Professor Nautiyal, and my other colleagues. Prabir just finished his speaking. I think so much has already been talked about the budget, and we are looking today primarily on how defense and foreign policy budgets, what do they say, what do they tell us? If something distinguishes in clubbing defense and foreign policy or foreign ministry budget, then I think it is the projection of India. If we are clubbing together defense budget and MEA's, Ministry of External Affairs budget, to see what it tells us, this tells us India's strategic objectives in long term, where India or India's leadership wants to take India in coming decades. And then if you look at the way India is evolving, largest young population, largest democracy, largest population country, fastest growing among the major economies, all said to be fourth largest, and then of course later third largest economy, increasingly hub of modern technology, a unique country that can produce high technology at very, very cost-effective prices and implement it at enormous mass scales. These are things that make India's strategic projections interesting, not just for us in India, but I think around the world. And that is where clubbing together Ministry of Defense and Ministry of External Affairs and reading their future trajectories by looking at the budgetary analysis perhaps becomes an interesting exercise. Something that Prabir just mentioned before me is how MEA is funded overall, generally hovering around 1% of the federal budget, of the budget of Government of India. And that makes it very interesting to then see what it is trying to achieve. And what it has been able to achieve is fairly interesting in terms of its diplomatic visibility around the world, diplomatic footwork, diplomatic outreach, in terms of making that whole emerging India image. But also what I want to underline is the mention that General Chakrabarti made in the beginning, and of course many others also underlined, the utilization issue. I remember Professor Nautiyal also mentioned how even in education sector, the utilization of budget is as much a challenge as procuring larger sums of money for your particular sector or your particular institution. And therefore, utilization often leads to issues where Ministry of Defense is often seen not being able to spend large parts of defense allocations more often than not. Now, why I'm saying this? Because Ministry of External Affairs has had an excellent record in budget utilization, usually staying at 95, 96% or above in some years, which could partly be explained because they don't have high capital expenditure component in their budgets, just like Ministry of Defense would have a very large size of capital budget in capital expenditure budget for themselves. So in that sense, I think it's interesting to see the comparisons of Ministry of Defense receiving about 13 to 14% of federal budget compared to Ministry of External Affairs receiving only 1% of the federal budget. Makes an interesting comparison. But remember, what Ministry of Defense does, nobody else can do. How to ensure defense of India. And then it goes way beyond. And just from the conventional understanding of defense of India, it does a lot of internal security responsibilities. It also, for about 2-3 decades now, has enormous focus on HADR, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief responsibilities. So Ministry of Defense goes out and does things that are not quintessential, typical defense in terms of conventional definition of responsibilities of Ministry of Defense. Now look at Ministry of External Affairs. The picture is completely reverse. Ministry of External Affairs usually lays out for us the broad bandwidth of do's and don'ts in terms of what is India's foreign policy vision. It explains it, it formulates that for us, but it is not the only ministry that conducts foreign policy. Allow me to say, and I'm sure Professor Nautiyal will vouch me, even each university has a little bit of foreign policy. Of course, every ministry has a foreign policy. There are sister cities. So in terms of implementation of foreign policy, there are many other actors involved, and you have to look at that budget as well, as to how that contributes in implementation of foreign policy. And of course, we all know that a certain critical part of foreign policy is also not just implemented, but even conceived of at Prime Minister's office or in the National Security Council Secretariat, or I would say Ministry of Trade and Commerce. So in that sense, that nuanced understanding of clubbing Ministry of Defense with Ministry of External Affairs is important before we start looking at what is the budget scenario for this year. I believe a lot has already been said on defense budget. So let me confine my comments to much more on Ministry of External Affairs as to how that ensures, with a limited budget, enormous responsibility of a diplomatic outreach around the world to nearly 210 countries and territories with 190 plus missions around the world and so on. Now, it's important to see that when we look at the federal budget, the largest allocations, in fact, the entire revenue resources generated go to Ministry of Finance. So Ministry of Finance naturally becomes a ministry that is number one in terms of receiving those allocations, then of course disbursing those allocations. And so nominally, of course, the Ministry of Finance would be seen as a ministry that gets largest resources at its disposal. But in actual reality, of course, we all understand it is Ministry of Defense. So if we have total 19.4 lakh crore generation of revenue for this year, 6.8 lakh crore goes to Ministry of Defense. Now compare that Ministry of Defense 6.8 lakh crore to mere 20,000 crores. 6.8 lakh crores MOD, 20,000, of course it is 20,516 crores, mere 1% budget that goes to Ministry of External Affairs. And of course, as I mentioned, it doesn't have a heavy capital expenditure. Ministry of External Affairs expenditures are broadly seen in three categories. One is called central sector or discretionary expenditure, which is how footwork is done in utilizing that money. Second component is establishment, staff, salaries, cars, petrol, and so on. Everyday expenditures that happen, establishment. And now remember, developmental partnerships is the main responsibility of Ministry of External Affairs, and therefore that is the third most important component of budgetary allocations. That does not happen in any other ministry. No other ministry gets a major chunk of its budget to build partnerships. They do build partnerships, but that's not the major responsibility. For Ministry of External Affairs, that's a major responsibility. So therefore, in this year, for example, 27% of that 1% of the federal budget that goes to Ministry of External Affairs, 27% of that is meant for developmental partnerships. Now, we also looked at in terms of trends of budgetary allocations. What made MEA draw enormous attention? See, normally all people, all of us, when we look at the budget, the first thing all of us want to look at is taxation. What is the new taxation structure? Then second thing we all want to look at is what are the major infrastructure, Gati Shakti related projects, because that affects everyday people. So we are looking at infrastructure. The third thing that usually draws attention of people when they're looking at India's budget is defense expenditure. What made Ministry of External Affairs budget look interesting last year, I'll come to this year later, is that for about 5-6 years, between 2017 to 2023, the annual budgetary increase of MEA, Ministry of External Affairs, were hovering around 4%, not even matching inflation. Remember last year, MEA received a 23% raise in their annual budget, which was very noticeable, partly because we were hosting, you remember, G20 summit meeting. So that was a major responsibility for Ministry of External Affairs. But that made headlines that Ministry of External Affairs was now receiving suddenly 23% raise in their annual budget. And by comparison, this year increase is impressive. If you look at, I said last 5 years, 4%. If you compare that to this year, 15.45%, then Ministry of External Affairs is drawing enough attention of national leaders. But because immediate preceding year, because of G20 summit meeting, received 23%, it looks like, oh, MEA is now getting less of a rise than it got last year. But if you look at the larger trend, I think it is showcasing that prioritizing of Ministry of External Affairs is right there. Nearly 16% raise in their annual budget. And something again which is very clear, which is persistent for several decades now and becoming increasingly much more visible. And I remember Semi asked question to Praveer about Look East policy, is the limited bandwidth of India's investment in building developmental partnerships. And I think that comes from the fact that, no giant can continue to rise and become effective unless it is able to handle pygmies around it. So we have to ensure we have borders that are safe, we have neighborhood that is friendly, and then make sure India rises. So therefore, there is nothing wrong when we see that major focus of MEA's developmental partnership investment related budget, which is aimed, of course, in building hydroelectric projects. You're hearing the one to be built in Northeast of a similar size that China is trying to build on Brahmaputra. So India is trying to build hydroelectric projects, power transmission lines, Bhutan and India, for example, housing in Maldives and Sri Lanka and so on, in building roads, building bridges and so on. So in immediate neighborhood, of course, with this gradual change in Bhutan's policy towards China, Bhutan continues to be traditionally, it's not now, traditionally Bhutan has been dependent enormously with the granting aids from India. So obviously for this year, once again, a large-sized allocation is made for Bhutan, 2,000 crore. Remember, 20,000 crore is MEA's budget. 2,000 crore is going only to Bhutan. 2,150 crore actually. Now, traditionally, this has always been the largest annual grant or budget of MEA's budget going to any neighboring country or any country. Cumulatively, you've heard of India investing $4 billion in Afghanistan, India now investing $4.5 billion in Sri Lanka. But annual allocations, Bhutan has always been number one. Now, if you compare this year's 2,150 crores for Bhutan, it definitely shows an improvement, a very interesting rise from 2,068 crore of last year budget allocations. But it is much smaller compared to the revised estimates. So one has to always look at what was the budgetary allocations and what are the revised estimates. So are your This year's allocations guided by last year's revised estimates, not in this case. They are guided by last year's budgetary allocations. Budgetary allocations last year, 2,068 crore. Revised estimates of last year, 2,543 crore. This year's allocations for Bhutan, 2,150 crore. This year's most impressive raise in neighborhood goes to Maldives. Maldives has really drawn enormous attention. You remember President Moizu visited India. Indian foreign minister has been going to Maldives. So that smoothening of the relationship, which was becoming China-centric at some stage, and India out was becoming the slogan, has been attended to now by providing a major jump. Because here, 600 crores to Maldives are much, much higher even from the revised estimates of last year. Revised estimates of last year were 470 crore. This year, budgetary allocations are 600 crore. Last year's budgetary allocations were only 400 crore. Similarly, Sri Lanka, I mentioned $4.5 billion cumulatively post-economic crisis. But annual budgetary allocations of Ministry of External Affairs is a slight interesting increase from last year's budgetary allocations of 245 crore to 300 crore this year.
Investing in what's trending is super easy with small case, जहां मिलते हैं ready-made stock portfolios based on trending ideas. So if you wish to explore investment opportunities based on market में नया क्या चल रहा है, download small case now. Investment in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all the related documents carefully before investing.
Nepal is another, of course, that has been interesting. I think earlier that figure was mentioned by Pravir of about 700 crore to Nepal. But India is now becoming global in that sense. So what are we doing at global level? Pravir mentioned about Chabahar. But remember, President Donald Trump is now threatening to, do away with the waivers that were given to India on sanctions to be slapped on India for investing on Chabahar. So in that sense, yes, Chabahar's budget continues as last year, 100 crore. But we will see whether that money is being spent this year or what happens to those sanctions to be imposed if waivers are removed. I think the most interesting, you remember Prime Minister had visited Guyana, and the whole regional multilateral organization had a summit meeting with the Indian Prime Minister. Indian Prime Minister went to Brazil, of course, for the G20 summit meeting. But interesting it is that the budget for Latin America has gone up from 30 to 60 crore, but looks much less compared to revised estimates of 90 crore. So Latin America is not receiving the attention that maybe it should have received, because we have to, go global in that sense. Indian Prime Minister, you remember earlier, a year before, had visited Papua New Guinea, and all the West South Pacific countries had come together and met him. Now, another area where we see is front-loading of India's culture. See, India's foreign policy is making sure that we project India's culture and diaspora. These are two important linkages. So this year, for example, 20 crore of the 2,000 crore for external, 20,000 crore budget, 1% of MEA's budget in that sense, is exclusively allocated to supporting cultural projects. India is also trying to open many new missions. You remember, in Southeast Asia, we are now also going to have a mission in the 11th country in the region. I know the capital is Delhi, but I'm trying to remember. Timor-Leste. We are opening a mission now there. So many new missions are being opened. And that budget is seeing about 9 to 10% increase. And of course, most interesting, Indians are now traveling around the world. So Passport Center's budget in MEA has witnessed a 50% increase. That means more and more people are going to be traveling to foreign countries for business, for pleasure, for whatever other reasons. And now look at this fact that this may be a small developmental partnerships related budget that India has, but this becomes increasingly more interesting because of the US aid under question now. United States Assistance for International Development, USAID, all their budgets have been put on a halt. A friend of mine was supposed to come to New Delhi on 20th February under that grant. And we were supposed to have a meeting here, and that has been now also put on pause. So that scholar is no longer able to visit India. I'm talking of a personal case that I know of. So US aid coming under question, likely to be, people even said, disbanded. US withdrawal from World Health Organization, Human Rights Council, Paris Climate Change Agreement. I think that will put much more focus on India's developmental aid now and India's developmental partnerships. And that would mean that we might see, why I'm making this point, we might see that the revised estimates, these are budgetary estimates. The revised estimates by the end of the financial year may see much more increase this year because anticipations from rising India are going to be very different. And now with United States withdrawing, retreating, shrinking in terms of its indulgences around the world, we'll see anticipation, expectations from India going up. And I assume that you will see this year that budget estimates and revised estimates will have much larger gap than we have had usually earlier years. Of course, next Thursday, today is Thursday, next Thursday, you will see Indian Prime Minister meeting President Donald Trump. And we are all waiting to see what comes out of that meeting and how India looks at, taking more responsibilities around the world as United States bring to focus much more inward. With that, let me stop here, and I wish all of you very well for the follow-up discussion from here. And I enjoyed listening to every one of you. And thank you again to the IMPRI team for hosting such an interesting meeting with very, very erudite scholars. And I was delighted to meet all of them online at least, and hope to see each of you offline sometime. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir. Very, very clear.